and welcome to Joffiel Whispers. My name is Nairi. The world in which I was born no longer exists. I find it extraordinary that the Egyptian community which surrounds me, despite the fact that the majority of people are extremely poor by Western standards, have embraced iPhones almost universally. I think of the old man in dirty clothes collecting rubbish who asked me for money one day and a few minutes later pulled out his phone. It seems so incongruous that these people who have little control over their material world are fully empowered in their ability to navigate the products of the digital world. They know all about YouTube and WhatsApp and the internet. They know it all. I keep coming back to unconscious fear as a factor in much of our decision making. We have become so dependent on digital technology, and the infrastructure of our environment is so centrally controlled that we literally don't know how we might survive without them. If they were to break down, how would we continue? How, in fact, will we survive? There's good reason to be fearful, and I imagine most of us do know that unconsciously and don't think about it for the most part. But there was a time not so long ago when we did live without the current structures, without the current matrix, if you like. How have things changed since World War II, and is it important to know that? Well, perhaps it could be useful to reflect on how it was then and how we managed in a simpler world. Our lives 70 years ago weren't as efficient as they seem to be now, but in fact, in my experience, the modern world is more efficient, but only superficially, because in a time where we could deal directly with one another, matters could be solved quickly. In 2024, the time taken to search for information on a computer in a bank, for instance, is much longer than just opening a reference book with an index at the back. We did know what was going on in the world because nothing changed very much, and radio communication served us well enough. My father was a writer and broadcaster, and one of his programs was delivered to American audiences from Australia on a weekly basis. Radio served us well because we communicated with language, without the distraction of visual images to entertain us, so we didn't miss important details. Language use then was more specific, more detailed, more sophisticated and more nuanced than it is now amongst the general population. And of course, we did have books. Our dominant sense is visual, and for that reason it can be used subliminally to control our perceptions. It can result in us becoming intellectually lazy because it requires no effort, and most of the images we are exposed to are designed to demand our attention, control our perceptions, and entertain us rather than inform us. They tap into what is colloquially called our reptilian brain, our basic instincts. That is why I prefer to watch interviews and conversations rather than illustrated reports. Because short clips focusing on facial expressions, dramatic images, and just moments in time extracted from larger events are designed to control our thought processes in quite a sinister way. I witnessed a demonstration of this as a student more than 40 years ago. We were shown a film of a man talking, a talking head as it was called then, about a subject which I've long forgotten. After a few minutes, a small image appeared in the lower corner of the screen and increased in size over the next few minutes until it filled the screen. The image was of an attractive woman in a red dress, sitting on a stool with her legs exposed, filing her nails. Suddenly the image disappeared and the man appeared again, who said, "And you didn't hear a word I said, did you?" It was very sobering and the message very clear. We are easily manipulated by visual effects. Let me give you a world perspective from Australia back then, when I was born, because we were still virtually a colony of Great Britain. How did we communicate without the internet for a start? Well, if we wanted to contact others, we had the telephone, although it wasn't possible to dial a number. We had to contact the exchange office, and they would say, "Number please," then connect a wire between their office and the phone number you gave them. Once connected, the operator's voice would say, "Putting you through." By the time I was an adult, calls were automatic, so you could dial anyone from the phone directly. If we wanted to make an overseas call in those days, it was necessary to call an international operator and book the call. It could take 3 days to make the connection. So in an emergency, it wasn't very useful. But there was another option, the telegram, from where, of course, comes the telegram app on the internet, which required a visit to the post office. You had to fill in a form and pay per word, and it would then be relayed to the recipient at the other end as a physical mail delivery. And there was always snail mail, written on paper and enclosed in an envelope with a stamp. So delicious to see the handwriting of someone near and dear to you who was away on distant shores. Travelling overseas was a major undertaking which few could afford or had the time to indulge in. It required a 6-week journey by ship, and there are only a few companies operating, 2 of them Greek-owned. The Greek shipping lines were cheaper than British or American lines, so they were the choice of most travellers. All countries in Europe were separate entities, so visas were required to enter any European country, and many other countries such as East Germany and Hungary were virtually closed to outsiders. Television sets weren't yet universal, so any news from the rest of the world was received by radio, much of which was from overseas. The first television sets, when they were introduced in the 1950s, were bulky pieces of equipment, and apart from local news, broadcast American entertainment shows for about 3 hours daily. What that means is that all the cultures of the world retained their own autonomy and their own integrity, each with its own gifts, which is one of the main reasons people wanted to visit them, to experience different cultures. These days, when I travel, every country feels the same, basically shares the same values, and the deeper parts of their cultures are forever and irretrievably lost, although some would argue otherwise. But in my experience, everything has changed. Australian values were generally British, and most Australians were of English or European descent, although there was quite a large Asian population. But we felt they were our near neighbours, and they had integrated well into Australian life since the first immigrants came out during the 1800s to join the gold rush. Additionally, they and extant Australians weren't separated by religious dogmas because most embraced Christian values, as did the majority of the population at the time. By the time I left, however, whole suburbs of Melbourne were Asian occupied, and there are no English words to be seen. They were literally Asian in lifestyle and culture. On the other side of Melbourne is huge outer suburb housing migrants, mostly from the Middle East and Africa. Australia has changed dramatically with mass migration or mass immigration, just like the rest of the world. How many people have a deep-rooted sense of where they belong in the modern transmigratory world? I was in my 20s when we began to see people who were obviously from countries other than Europe. I had a friend in the 1970s who came from the West Indies, and she was always under observation when she was out in the community, not just because she was an elegant soul, but because she was obviously different. That's all changed now to the point where before I left Australia, I felt a foreigner in my own country, because I'd be one of the few pale-skinned people inside. It was obvious I was surrounded by immigrants rather than my own tribe, and while I take all human beings as they come, The values of those newcomers in some ways are obviously different to my own, resulting in a sense of being an outsider and not belonging anymore. It felt as though if anything threatening happened, no one would have my back. Talking about such things, of course, has a shadow of political incorrectness hanging over it, but it's the reality whether we want to accept it or not. Where I currently live, in Egypt, there has been little immigration, and they, like their Middle Eastern counterparts, appear to have a sense of belonging and ownership no longer seen in most Western and post-colonial countries. So why do I touch on this politically incorrect subject? Well, the answer's simple. When communities are no longer autonomous, when there are few shared values, especially religious values, there's no longer a sense of commitment to the community as a whole, to the country. People tend to be self-serving, with little interest in others' welfare, except their own small community. Little agreement across the board, and consequently there is disunity and disempowerment. And of course all this appears to be quite deliberate. Separated communities are easy to control, and the so-called governments have more control over these divided communities because there is power in numbers, and united communities have more control over their lives. I see this in Egypt, where people are still tribal and autonomous, which means they can survive despite government intervention in so many ways. They make their own rules, and although life can be tough, they are generally a united force. And happy like that. In America, social division was about the European descendants and African slave descendants. Now that is no longer a huge problem, as people have begun to realise the world doesn't need to be divided by race, although there are still some who want to keep that narrative alive. But there are other divisive issues being fed into the collective subconscious now, apart from politics, which include LGBTQ issues, gender issues, climate change, sexuality, religion, flat earth theories, illegal immigration, the true history of the human race, questions about Palestine and many others, all created not by the people, but by the media and governments, which of course is the result of mass communication, which is a double-edged sword, since along with having created greater opportunities for information sharing, it's also an opportunity to brainwash the population into thinking particular subjects and ideologies have value when they are really a distraction created in order to gain greater and greater control over us. For most of my life, there was a solid socio-economic middle class. Our middle class lives were secure and interesting. We could afford to do most of the things we wanted, including travel overseas. That changed in 2008 when the stock market crash took out about 50% of middle class retirement investments, and suddenly retirees, myself and my husband included, were in a position of finding ourselves separated from financial independence and obliged to rely on government welfare payments. Our lifestyle altered overnight, and we had to curb our spending and reduce activities we previously enjoyed. My husband's superannuation payments continued, but as with most professional retirees, he'd been persuaded to invest in the stock market, and there was no apparent option to invest his retirement money. Most people are not monetary experts. They don't know how to manipulate the money market the way some people do. And he saw his hard-earned money from a lifetime of work swept out from under him, and the pleasures of retirement reduced considerably, although not entirely. Nevertheless, there was always some anxiety about financial matters. If it had all been an unfortunate turn of events, it would have been manageable. But as I've discovered over the years, manipulation of the stock market comes back to the American Central Bank and others, and it was a deliberate manipulation of the financial status quo. Our money was, to all intents and purposes, stolen from us, and we never recovered our previous standard of living. The pain of deception remains with me to this day. So does the past matter? Yes, I believe it does. Because the structures in which we live are not necessary to leading a good life. Living in simplicity, and I don't mean poverty, just simplicity, has many advantages. Were we better off when I was young? Yes, in some ways we were. We felt a greater sense of freedom in many ways than we do now, and generally we felt safer. But poverty did exist back then. Of course, it's always been part of life. And if there were to be any positive outcome of mass communication and digital technology, it must surely only be regarded as successful if it leads to better lives for all. Liberty, equality, and fraternity is an ideal that has never been fully realised. But I believe we must never lose sight of that ideal. With shared knowledge, not myths, not all the distractions, not attending to all the distractions that are out there to take us from the main goal. We do have an opportunity now to make that a reality, but we need to do it wisely. We can't go back in history. We live in a digital world and it's here to stay. It's a stimulating and exciting world. But if it all collapsed, there's still a way to live together that is equally stimulating and satisfying if we're to embrace it. We are survivors as a species, and when we seek true knowledge, wisdom, positive action and cooperation, we can be extraordinary. We are extraordinary. Thank you for joining me. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can do so on my website, narij.com, and find a little bit about me there. Also look at some of my paintings and my music. And if you'd like, read chapter 1 of Joffiel Whispers. I hope to see you next time. Until then, stay well, stay blessed.